They threw her out like a useless old woman, but she was secretly the founder of a billion-dollar company, and the lesson she gave her family would change their lives forever. It was an ordinary Sunday night in suburban New Jersey, but inside the Hale home, everything was coming apart. Melissa's patience had finally snapped. She glared at her mother-in-law across the table, the woman she blamed for their shame, their debt, and their constant embarrassment. "Ruth, how can you sit there acting proud when you can't even afford a new coat?" Her voice sliced through the silence. Ethan tried to calm her down, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion. Mortgage payments, tuition, medical bills, every word his wife said carried the weight of truth he didn't want to face. Across the table, Ruth Hale, 72, sat still, fingers wrapped around a tiny worn purse. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. Only her eyes moved, watching the son she'd raised fight the guilt he couldn't hide. "Mom," Ethan finally said, voice trembling, "maybe it's better if you stayed somewhere that could take care of you. You know, where you'd be more comfortable." Ruth didn't flinch. "You mean somewhere that isn't your home?" she replied quietly. Her words froze the room. Melissa looked away, pretending not to hear the crack in Ethan's voice as he whispered, "We just can't do this anymore." Zoe, their 12-year-old daughter, appeared from the hallway, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Grandma, you can't leave," she cried, grabbing Ruth's sleeve. Ruth forced a smile that barely held. "It's okay, sweetheart. Grandma's just going on a little trip." Melissa pulled Zoe away, saying sharply, "Enough, Zoe. Adults are talking." The girl's sobs echoed through the hall like a warning no one wanted to hear. Outside, the winter air stung Ruth's face as she stepped into the waiting taxi. Through the window, she saw Zoe's small hands pressed against the glass, begging silently for her to stay. "Where to, ma'am?" the driver asked. Ruth looked straight ahead. Maple Ridge Care Center. As the car rolled away, the lights of her son's house faded behind her, along with the last illusion that love was unconditional. But what Ethan and Melissa didn't know was this. The woman they just sent away wasn't broke, and she wasn't helpless. For 30 years she'd kept a secret, a promise, a fortune, and a test. And by the time the truth came out, the Hales would have to learn the hard way what family really costs. The taxi ride was silent except for the soft hum of the road. Ruth's hands rested on her small purse, the same one Melissa mocked her for. Inside wasn't money, but a folded photograph. A younger Ruth, her husband Thomas, and a little boy in overalls holding an ice cream cone, Ethan. That picture was all she'd ever kept close. When Thomas got sick 30 years ago, he made her promise something most people would find impossible. Raise him to work, Ruth, to fight, but never tell him about the money, he'd said, his voice breaking through the rattle of hospital machines. Not until he becomes a man who values people more than comfort. She had promised. And she kept it. For 3 decades, she'd lived like a woman, scraping by, cooking for others, cleaning, saving every penny, letting the world think she had nothing. But behind that quiet mask, Ruth built an empire. Oakhaven Group, from a single home repair business she and Thomas had started in their garage. She made every decision through other people, never signing her own name. Her late husband's words guided every choice. Wealth is a test, not a reward. As the taxi turned down Maple Ridge Lane, Ruth glanced at the care home ahead, a beige building with too many cameras and not enough flowers. "This the place?" the driver asked. Ruth nodded. "Yes, the last stop, for now." She stepped out, pulling her thin coat tighter around her shoulders. The automatic doors slid open with a hiss, releasing the smell of antiseptic and overcooked vegetables. A nurse behind the counter smiled politely, the kind of smile given to people who've been left behind. "Mrs. Hale?" "We've been expecting you," the nurse said, clipboard in hand. Ruth returned a quiet nod. Her new room was small, 1 bed, 1 dresser, 1 window overlooking a parking lot. It wasn't much, but Ruth wasn't looking for comfort. She unpacked slowly, setting the old photo of Thomas by the lamp. "You were right," she whispered. "He doesn't understand yet, but he will." That night, while other residents dozed in front of muted televisions, Ruth sat by the window watching snowflakes drift past the glass. She thought of Zoe's face, the way her small hands clung to her sleeve, and her heart ached. But pain had never stopped Ruth, it only focused her. She took out her phone, opened a secure line, and made a single call. "Chairwoman Hale," said a male voice on the other end. "We've been trying to reach you for days. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Ruth said, "but things are about to get educational." "For whom, ma'am?" "My son," she replied. "And his wife?" The next morning, across town, Ethan Hale dressed for work, the biggest opportunity of his career. His company, Hale Dynamics, was about to present to Oakhaven Group, a massive conglomerate known for its secrecy and influence. He didn't know the founder's name. No one did. "If we land this contract," he told Melissa over coffee, "it could change everything." She smiled, thinking about their mortgage. "Then let's make sure we do." Neither of them could imagine that the mysterious Oakhaven chairwoman, the woman who would decide Ethan's fate, was the same one they'd thrown out of their house less than 24 hours ago. Maple Ridge Care Center was a place built for forgetting not just faces but entire lives. The walls were painted a soft yellow that looked like sunlight but felt like waiting. Ruth spent her first morning sitting by the window, watching other residents shuffle down the hallway in their slippers. Some smiled, most didn't. Every few minutes, a distant intercom voice reminded everyone to take their pills, eat their breakfast, or prepare for visiting hours that never came. At lunch, Ruth met her first neighbor, a retired librarian named Mrs. Whitaker, who carried a notebook full of names. She wasn't writing stories, just keeping track of which residents still had family that showed up. "It helps me remember who's lucky," she said with a dry laugh. Ruth smiled faintly, thinking of Ethan. "And who isn't?" she whispered. That night, Ruth joined a small group in the lounge. They played bingo, though no one cared about winning. A man named Henry Delgado, once a machinist from Newark, complained about his sons who never called. "They've got their own lives now," he muttered. "Guess I'm just too old to fit in one." Ruth looked at him and saw her son's future if something didn't change. She knew the pattern too well. Children working themselves to exhaustion, parents discarded when they became inconvenient. America called it progress. Ruth called it amnesia. Days turned to weeks. Staff began to notice Ruth's calm precision, how she folded her clothes perfectly, how she listened more than she spoke, how she paid attention to the smallest details. To them, she was another quiet old lady trying to pass time, but to Ruth, this was reconnaissance. She'd built a company by observing people, and she wasn't about to stop. Every night she wrote down notes in a small black notebook. Names, dates, problems no one else saw. "Every broken system," she murmured, "starts with a forgotten person." One afternoon, as she was reorganizing her few belongings, a nurse knocked on her door. "Mrs. Hale, you've got a call at the front desk. Says it's urgent." Ruth hesitated. Only one person had this number. She walked down the hall, picked up the phone, and heard a familiar voice. "Madam Chair," said the man on the line, his tone careful. "It's Donovan from Oakhaven headquarters. We've been trying to reach you for days. The audit's scheduled for next week, but your son's company, Hale Dynamics, is on the short list for our new supplier contract." Ruth's eyes narrowed slightly. "My son?" "Yes, ma'am. Ethan Hale. He's leading the presentation himself. Quite ambitious." Ruth's reflection stared back at her in the glass partition, a frail old woman to anyone else, but inside, the strategist returned. "Proceed as planned," she said, "but I'll be there in person." "Understood, Chairwoman. Should we notify Mr. Hale?" "No," she replied softly. "Not yet. Let's see how he treats strangers first." When Ruth hung up, Mrs. Whitaker passed by, pushing her walker. "Bad news, dear?" she asked. Ruth smiled faintly. "Not bad, just overdue." That night, while others slept through television reruns, Ruth sat awake by the lamp, reviewing the documents Donovan had sent to her private email. Hale Dynamics, her son's company, was struggling, just like his marriage. Debt, layoffs, overextension. She could save him with one phone call, one signature. But that wasn't the lesson Thomas had wanted. Ethan needed to learn what his father had died, knowing that love without humility rots into pride. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane. Ruth closed the file and whispered to the photograph of her late husband on the nightstand. "It's time, Thomas. Our boy's about to meet the woman he thinks he left behind." At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, Ethan Hale stood in front of the mirror in his small office, fixing his tie for what felt like the 100th time. The reflection staring back wasn't that of a confident executive, but of a man trying to convince himself he still had control. "This is it," he whispered. If Oakhaven likes what they see, everything changes. His company, Hale Dynamics, was running out of time and money. Their debt was closing in, and their employees were anxious. The only hope left was a single contract with Oakhaven Group, one of the most powerful yet secretive conglomerates in the United States. Melissa leaned against the doorframe, coffee in hand, watching her husband adjust his tie again. "They say nobody's ever seen the founder of Oakhaven," she said, trying to sound casual. "No photos, no interviews, no board appearances. Some people think it's a reclusive man from Boston. Others swear it's an old widow from upstate." Ethan gave a tired smile. "Whoever they are, let's just hope they like what they hear today." By 10 o'clock sharp, Oakhaven's audit team arrived. 5 individuals stepped through the glass doors of Hale Dynamics headquarters, their dark suits and calm movements cutting through the nervous chatter of the staff. At the front was a tall man named Donovan, Oakhaven's head of operations. Behind him walked a woman in a tailored black suit, wearing dark glasses, and a stillness that felt heavier than authority. No one knew her name, no one dared to ask. Ethan greeted them at the entrance, his handshake firm but his palms damp. "Welcome to Hale Dynamics. We're honored to have you." "Thank you, Mr. Hale," Donovan said politely. "We look forward to learning more about your operation." The tour began. Ethan led them across the assembly floor, pointing out machinery and production lines. "Everything we build here is made in America," he said with rehearsed pride. "We kept our workforce local, even when outsourcing would have been cheaper." Donovan nodded, impressed. The silent woman in glasses stayed a few steps behind, her gaze sharp and deliberate. She wasn't looking at the machines. She was watching Ethan. After an hour, they gathered in the main conference room for the presentation. The walls were lined with corporate slogans: integrity, innovation, resilience. Ethan spoke with practiced enthusiasm, showing charts and data, explaining how Hale Dynamics could become a vital partner in Oakhaven's supply chain. This was his moment, proof that he could succeed without help from anyone, especially the mother he'd just sent away. When he finished, Donovan folded his hands. "Impressive, Mr. Hale. Oakhaven values family businesses that stand for loyalty and perseverance." Ethan smiled, feeling a rare flicker of pride. "That's what we're about," he replied. Then, for the first time, the woman in dark glasses spoke. Her voice was calm, deliberate, almost disarmingly familiar. "And what about your own family, Mr. Hale?" she asked. "Do they feel that same loyalty?" Ethan blinked, thrown off balance. I'm sorry?" She leaned forward slightly. "Your family, your wife, your daughter, your mother, do they believe in your company as much as you do?" The room seemed to tighten around him. "Of course," he said, forcing a laugh. "My wife supports me. My daughter's proud. My mother—" He hesitated. "She's at a care home now. It's better for her. She's comfortable there." The woman tilted her head, expression unreadable. "Comfort," she repeated softly. "Yes, that's important." She stood abruptly, pushing in her chair with quiet precision. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Hale." Donovan rose with her, signaling the end of the meeting. "We'll review your proposal and contact you soon," he said before leading the group out. When the door closed, Ethan exhaled, the adrenaline slowly draining away. His hands trembled. He told himself it had gone well, that he hadn't said anything wrong. But something about that woman's tone lingered in his mind. Do they feel that same loyalty? He tried to shake it off. Melissa texted seconds later. "How did it go?" Ethan typed back. "It went well, I think." But the words didn't feel true. Meanwhile, in the black SUV heading back toward the city, the silent advisor removed her glasses. Ruth Hale stared out the tinted window, her reflection ghosted over the gray skyline. "He still doesn't understand," she murmured. Donovan turned from the front seat. "He seems competent," he said carefully, "but not grounded." Ruth's lips curved into something between sadness and resolve. "He's chasing success like it's a finish line. He still hasn't learned that it's supposed to be a mirror." She opened her phone and scrolled through her photos until she found one of Zoe smiling, freckles across her nose, holding a hand-drawn card that read, "To Grandma, my hero." Ruth's voice softened. "Maybe she'll be the one who breaks the cycle." The car turned toward the Oakhaven headquarters tower as the late afternoon sun burned gold through the clouds. Ruth closed her phone and leaned back in her seat, her eyes steady with purpose. "It's time," she whispered. "He thinks I'm gone. Let's see what he does when the truth walks back in." The next morning, Hale Dynamics buzzed like a hive on the edge of panic. Ethan arrived early, wearing the same gray suit as yesterday, though he'd pressed it twice to look fresh. This was the day Oakhaven Group would deliver its verdict, the contract that could save his company or bury it. Melissa texted him before sunrise, "You'll crush it today. This is our moment." Ethan wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe a lot of things. By 10 o'clock, the entire management team was assembled in the glass conference room. Donovan from Oakhaven entered first, followed by 3 analysts, and finally the same woman in the black suit. The one who had asked about his family. She looked different today, sharper, colder, yet strangely familiar in the morning light. "Good morning, everyone," Donovan said, placing a folder on the table. "Oakhaven Group would like to thank Hale Dynamics for yesterday's presentation. Before we proceed, our chairwoman has requested to speak with your lead project manager directly." Ethan blinked. "The chairwoman? She's here?" "Yes," Donovan said with a polite smile. "She's here in person." For a moment, no one moved. The woman in the black suit removed her sunglasses and looked directly at him. Ethan's breath caught. The voice, the shape of the face, the quiet command, they crashed together in his mind. "Hello, Ethan," she said. He froze. The air in the room seemed to vanish. "Mom?" The others exchanged confused glances. Donovan cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale, allow me to introduce the founder and chairwoman of Oakhaven Group, Mrs. Ruth Hale." Ethan's world blurred. His mother, the woman he had left at a care home, was sitting before him dressed like the kind of person his company begged for contracts. "You're the founder?" he managed to whisper. Ruth nodded calmly. "For 30 years. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. "That's impossible. You worked at diners. Ruth smiled faintly. "You saw what I wanted you to see." The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the overhead lights. Ruth leaned forward. "I built Oakhaven from the same garage your father and I started in. I never told you because he made me promise not to. He wanted you to learn humility, to understand what hard work means without safety nets or shortcuts. I kept that promise." Ethan's voice cracked. "All these years, you watched me struggle?" "Yes," Ruth said quietly. "And I watched what struggle did to your heart." Melissa's voice broke the tension as she entered the room late, smiling until she saw Ruth. Her purse slipped from her hand. "Mrs. Hale, what are you—" She stopped, the color draining from her face. "Wait, you're the chairwoman?" Ruth's gaze didn't waver. "You wanted a mother-in-law with a brand purse, Melissa. You just never asked what brand I built." No one spoke. The executives around the table sat motionless, unsure whether to stand or vanish. Ruth stood up slowly, her authority filling the room without raising her voice. "For years I lived as the poor woman you couldn't wait to be rid of. And for years I watched both of you measure love in dollars. Today, that lesson ends." Ethan opened his mouth but couldn't form words. Ruth continued, her tone steady and final. "You want success, Ethan? Earn it with honesty, not arrogance. You want respect, Melissa? Start by showing it to those who have less. Oakhaven will not be granting you a contract today, not yet. First, you'll have to pass something far more important than a financial audit." Donovan looked up, startled. "Ma'am, should I—" Ruth raised a hand. "Leave us." The room emptied until only Ruth, Ethan, and Melissa remained. Ruth walked to the window overlooking the parking lot. "When your father died, he told me to wait until you became a man who values others before himself. I've waited 30 years. She turned, her expression soft but unyielding. "I'm still waiting." Ethan stepped closer, voice trembling. "Mom, I didn't know. I thought—" "You thought I was a burden," Ruth said. "Now you know what it feels like to be underestimated." Melissa tried to speak, but Ruth's eyes silenced her. "Don't apologize yet," Ruth said. "Apologies mean nothing without change. I'll decide what happens next." She gathered her briefcase and paused at the door. "You both wanted a second chance. I'll give you one, but it won't be easy." As Ruth walked out, Ethan's knees felt weak. Melissa stood frozen, her mind racing between panic and disbelief. The woman they had pushed away like trash had turned out to be the one person who could rewrite their fate. In the hallway, Ruth put her sunglasses back on. Donovan fell in step beside her. "Do we proceed with the next phase?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Ruth said. "But not in the boardroom. The lesson they need doesn't happen behind a desk." She pressed the elevator button and whispered to herself, "They sent me away to a nursing home. Let's see what happens when the old woman starts giving orders again." That night, the Hale household was unrecognizable. No one spoke. The kitchen, usually filled with the hum of a television or the clatter of dishes, sat in heavy silence. Melissa stood at the sink, staring out the window, her reflection pale and hollow. Ethan sat at the table with a glass of water that hadn't been touched in an hour. Their daughter Zoe sat nearby doing homework, but her parents' stillness made even the sound of her pencil feel intrusive. Finally, Melissa broke the silence. "So, it was her," she said, almost to herself. "Your mother, the old woman we sent away." She turned to him, voice trembling with anger and disbelief. "You're telling me she's that Ruth Hale? The founder of Oakhaven Group? The same company we were begging for a contract?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Yes. She kept it hidden all these years. Dad made her promise not to tell me until I learned what responsibility meant." His words sounded small, like a child explaining a punishment he didn't understand. "And I guess I failed that test." Melissa let out a sharp laugh that didn't sound like her. "Failed? Ethan, she humiliated us, in front of your entire team. Do you realize what this means? Everyone at the company knows our mother lives in a nursing home. They'll think we abandoned her." Ethan looked up, his voice low. "We did. That shut her down." For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the refrigerator humming like a reminder of how ordinary their lives had been before that day. Zoe finally looked up from the table. "Mom, Dad, is Grandma really rich?" Her voice was innocent, but her question cut deeper than she knew. Ethan tried to smile. "Something like that, honey." "But why'd you send her away?" Zoe asked. "She always bought me ice cream and told me stories. She wasn't mean." Melissa froze. The words hit her like a slap. "Zoe, that's not how things work. Grown-ups have to make hard decisions." Zoe frowned. "Then why did your hard decision make everyone sad?" Ethan looked away, eyes wet. For years, he'd told himself that every compromise was for his family's sake, the long hours, the cold dinners, the quiet guilt. But now, he saw what his ambition had cost. The very lessons his mother had tried to teach him, gratitude, humility, kindness, had turned into weaknesses he'd learned to hide. Melissa sat down, rubbing her temples. "We can fix this," she whispered. "We'll go see her tomorrow. We'll explain everything." Ethan shook his head. "She doesn't want explanations. She said there'd be a test, a second chance." Melissa frowned. "A test? What does that even mean?" "I don't know," Ethan said. "But if I know Mom, it won't be about money. It'll be about who we are." Hours passed. Ethan sat in his office, scrolling through old photos of his mother's birthdays, holidays, ordinary mornings. He hadn't realized how many years were missing between them. She'd always been there in the background, quiet, practical, never asking for anything. He remembered once, when he was 12, finding her asleep at the kitchen table after a double shift. Her hand was still wrapped around a pencil. She'd been teaching herself bookkeeping. He had no idea then that those sleepless nights would build an empire. Melissa appeared at the doorway, her face softer now. "Do you think she'll forgive us?" she asked. "I think she'll make us earn it," Ethan said. He looked up at her, and for the first time in years, there was no pretense in his eyes, only shame and a flicker of determination. "We're going to that nursing home tomorrow morning. Whatever she asks, we'll do it, no matter what." Melissa nodded, but her voice was unsteady. "Whatever she asks." She tried to sound firm, but the words carried more fear than conviction. In the quiet that followed, Zoe appeared again, holding a crayon, drawing 3 figures, holding hands under a sundae. "Grandma's still part of our family, right?" she asked. Ethan took the paper gently. The stick figures were labeled Mom, Dad, and Grandma. His throat tightened. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said softly. "She always was." Later that night, after Zoe had gone to bed, Melissa stood by the window, looking at the city lights. "Ethan," she whispered, "if your mom really owns Oakhaven, do you realize how much she's worth?" Ethan didn't even turn around. It doesn't matter. She stared at him, confused. What do you mean, it doesn't matter? We could change everything, our house, our debts, Zoe's future. Ethan cut her off. She didn't hide money, Melissa. She hid meaning. She wanted me to learn what kind of man I'd become when I thought no one was watching. Melissa fell silent. She didn't say it out loud, but in her heart she knew that test wasn't for Ethan alone. The next morning, the Hales would walk into Maple Ridge Care Center, not as visitors, but as defendants in a quiet trial of character. And Ruth Hale, the mother they had underestimated, was about to teach them that redemption always comes with conditions. The next morning arrived gray and heavy, the kind of morning that carried judgment in its silence. Ethan parked the car outside Maple Ridge Care Center, but no one moved to get out. The building loomed ahead, beige walls, narrow windows, the same place they had once called a solution. Melissa sat beside him, fingers tightening around her purse. "Do we just walk in and apologize?" she asked quietly. Ethan shook his head. "We don't walk in asking for forgiveness, we walk in ready to listen." Inside, the front desk attendant recognized them instantly. Her polite smile faltered before returning out of habit. "You're here to see Mrs. Hale?" "Yes," Ethan said. "Her son." The nurse's tone softened slightly. "Room 201. She's expecting you." They walked down the disinfected hallway, the smell of cleaning solution thick in the air. Ethan's heart pounded with every step. When they reached the door, he knocked once. "Come in," Ruth's voice said from inside, steady, unreadable. She sat by the window, dressed in a pale blue sweater and pearl earrings, a newspaper folded neatly beside her. When she turned to face them, Melissa's knees almost buckled. Ruth didn't look frail anymore. She looked in control, every movement deliberate, every word measured. "So," Ruth began, "the prodigal children return." Ethan swallowed hard. "Mom, She raised a hand. "Don't start with apologies. Words are cheap. I'm interested in action." Melissa stepped forward. "Please, Mrs. Hale." "Ruth," the older woman corrected. "Titles only matter to people who forget their worth." For a moment no one spoke. Then Ruth leaned back in her chair. "You said you wanted another chance. I'm willing to give you one, but you won't like the terms." Ethan nodded slowly. "Name them." Ruth looked out the window before answering. "For 1 full year you will treat me as if I have nothing. No contracts, no money, no shortcuts. You will visit me not as Oakhaven's chairwoman, but as an old woman who lives here. If I ever sense that your kindness depends on my wealth, the deal ends." Ethan nodded again, the weight of it already pressing on him. "We can do that." "I'm not finished," Ruth said. She turned her gaze toward Melissa. "And you, Melissa, every Saturday for the next 52 weeks, you will volunteer here at Maple Ridge. You will assist the nurses, help the residents bathe, serve meals, hold hands, listen to stories you think don't matter. No skipping, no excuses." Melissa's face went pale. "Every week? For a year?" "Yes," Ruth said firmly. "You will give this place what you refuse to give me your time." Ethan started to speak, but Ruth cut him off again. "If you fail, if I hear even one complaint or see 1 ounce of insincerity, everything ends. No forgiveness, no reconciliation. You'll lose not only me, but the legacy that could have been yours." Melissa tried to steady her voice. "Is this about punishing us?" Ruth shook her head. "No, punishment is about guilt. This is about perspective. You've both spent years defining worth by what you own. Now I want to see who you are when all you own is effort." Ethan exhaled slowly. "And if we do it? If we prove ourselves?" Ruth smiled faintly. "Then we start over, not as benefactor and heirs, but as a family." For a long moment, none of them moved. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on Ruth's wall. Finally, Ethan extended his hand. "We'll do it," he said. "Whatever it takes." Ruth looked at his hand but didn't take it. "Promises are easy," she said quietly. "We'll see what they're worth in a year." Melissa's voice cracked as she finally spoke. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll volunteer. Every Saturday." Ruth studied her face, searching for sincerity. "Do you mean that, or do you mean until it's convenient?" Melissa hesitated. "I mean it," she said, this time without flinching. Ruth nodded once, a faint hint of approval crossing her expression. "Good, then we have an agreement." Ethan stepped forward. "Mom, thank you." Ruth's eyes softened, but her tone stayed steady. Don't thank me yet. Redemption doesn't come from what you say today. It comes from what you choose every day after this. As they turned to leave, Ruth called out quietly, "Ethan." He stopped at the door. "Yes?" "Next week," she said. "Bring Zoe. She should see what real family looks like." Outside, Melissa leaned against the car, breathing hard as if she'd just escaped a courtroom. 52 weeks, she murmured. I don't even know how to do half the things she said. Ethan looked at her, eyes tired but clear. Then you'll learn. Melissa crossed her arms. What about you? What's your part in all this? Ethan glanced back at the building. Mine's simpler, he said quietly. I have to become the kind of man she was waiting for. The cold morning wind whipped across the parking lot as they got into the car. Behind the window on the second floor, Ruth watched them drive away. She didn't smile. She simply whispered to herself, "Now the work begins." Saturday came too quickly. The morning light cut through the curtains of the Hale house like a reminder of something owed. Melissa sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone. For a woman who had once managed client meetings, charity galas, and school fundraisers without breaking a sweat, the idea of volunteering in a care home filled her with dread. "A whole year," she whispered. 52 Saturdays. Ethan handed her a thermos of coffee. "You'll be fine," he said, though his tone carried more hope than certainty. "It's not a punishment, Melissa. It's a chance." She looked up sharply. "A chance for what? To wash strangers and clean up after them?" Ethan hesitated. "Maybe to understand her world." Melissa rolled her eyes, but deep down the words stayed. She grabbed her jacket and keys. "Let's just get this over with." At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, she walked through the glass doors of Maple Ridge Care Center. The smell of antiseptic and powdered eggs hit first sterile, heavy, and old. A nurse at the counter greeted her politely. "You must be Mrs. Hale, Mrs. Ruth Hale's daughter-in-law, correct?" "Yes," Melissa said, trying to sound confident. "Wonderful," the nurse replied, flipping through a clipboard. "We'll start you with Mrs. Whitaker in room 112. She needs help with her morning bath." Melissa froze. "I'm sorry, what?" The nurse smiled kindly, but her tone left no room for negotiation. "We'll show you how, you'll be fine." Minutes later, Melissa found herself standing in a small tiled bathroom, holding a towel, while Mrs. Whitaker, a thin woman in her 80s with soft gray curls, sat on a stool beside the tub. "Don't look so scared, dear," the old woman said with a grin. "I've been doing this longer than you've been alive." Melissa managed a nervous laugh. I've never done this before." "Well," Mrs. Whitaker said, "then today's the day." By the time they were done, Melissa's shirt sleeves were soaked, her back ached, and her patience had frayed to threads. She smiled politely, helped the woman into her robe, and stepped out into the hall with a sigh that came from somewhere deep. "I can't believe I signed up for this," she muttered under her breath. The next task came before she caught her breath. "Mrs. Hale?" another nurse called. "Could you please help Mr. Delgado with his morning walk?" Mr. Delgado, a retired machinist with kind eyes and a stubborn limp, waited by the doorway. "You're new," he said with a smirk. "Yes, sir," she replied. "Don't call me sir," he said. "Makes me feel like I should salute." They walked slowly down the corridor. He spoke about his days working factory lines in Newark, the noise of the machines, the smell of metal and oil. "Hard work," he said proudly. "But you know what the hardest part was? Not being needed anymore." Something in his tone stopped Melissa cold. Not being needed anymore. The words echoed louder than the hallway clock. She thought of Ruth sitting in this same building, her face calm but her eyes too quiet. By the time her shift ended, Melissa was physically drained and emotionally raw. Her hands ached, her clothes smelled faintly of bleach, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the people here saw something she hadn't in years: gratitude. At the exit, she passed Ruth sitting in the garden with a small group of residents. Ruth didn't wave. She didn't even look up. Melissa hesitated, unsure if she should approach, but decided against it. She left quietly, telling herself it didn't matter. The next Saturday, she returned mostly because she didn't want to give Ruth the satisfaction of thinking she'd quit. This time, the work felt just as hard, but something small had changed. She remembered people's names. She asked questions. When Mrs. Whitaker told her about the son who hadn't visited in 5 years, Melissa found herself listening, really listening for the first time. By week 3, she knew the routines: who liked tea instead of coffee, who pretended not to need help but secretly did, who waited by the window every morning for a car that never came. She started bringing fresh flowers from her garden. She even smiled at the nurses. Then, one morning, while helping Mrs. Whitaker fold laundry, the older woman said, "You remind me of my daughter-in-law. She used to complain about me all the time." Melissa stopped folding. What changed? She realized that time doesn't wait. Mrs. Whitaker said softly. By the time she wanted to fix things, I'd already forgiven her. The words sank into Melissa like a slow, warm burn. That night, back home, she sat quietly at the dinner table while Ethan and Zoe talked about school and work. She couldn't stop thinking about Ruth sitting alone in her room, the way she hadn't even looked up when Melissa passed her. Later, as she lay in bed, she whispered into the dark, "Maybe this isn't supposed to be easy." She didn't know it yet, but that small admission, that whisper of humility, was the first true step toward forgiveness. And in a few days, when tragedy struck inside Maple Ridge, Melissa would discover what real compassion demanded. It happened on her 5th Saturday. The morning had begun like any other, a gray drizzle outside, the faint hum of daytime television echoing down the hall. Melissa was helping arrange breakfast trays in the common room when a nurse's shout sliced through the monotony. "Room 104, call emergency." Trays clattered. Someone screamed. Melissa froze for half a heartbeat before running toward the sound. Inside the small room, Mrs. Jenkins, the soft-spoken woman who always saved her pudding for others, lay slumped in her chair, her eyes half open, her breathing shallow. A nurse was already checking for a pulse. No response. She yelled. "Move!" the head nurse barked, grabbing the emergency kit. "Call 911. Melissa's hands trembled as she fumbled for the phone on the wall. Her voice cracked as she relayed the address, the words "cardiac arrest" sounding foreign in her mouth. When she turned back, the nurse was performing compressions, her arms moving with brutal precision. "Come on, Helen," the nurse whispered between counts. "Stay with me." Melissa stood uselessly at first, the smell of antiseptic burning her nose. Then instinct or something deeper pushed her forward. She knelt beside the nurse, holding Mrs. Jenkins's hand. "You're not alone," she whispered. "Please stay." Her own tears dripped onto the woman's arm. Minutes stretched into a blur until the paramedics arrived. The room filled with motion tubes, monitors, orders shouted in calm chaos. And then, as quickly as it began, they were gone, rushing Mrs. Jenkins down the hall on a stretcher. Silence rushed in like a wave. Melissa sat on the floor, shaking. Her hands, still warm from holding the old woman's, now felt unbearably empty. One of the nurses knelt beside her. "You did good," she said quietly. "Most volunteers freeze?" Melissa wiped her eyes. She's going to make it, right?" "We'll see," the nurse replied, "but you stayed. That matters." Hours later, Melissa was still sitting in the waiting area when Ruth appeared. She wasn't dressed in her usual understated sweaters. Today she wore a navy suit, her posture straight, her face unreadable. For a moment, Melissa couldn't find her voice. "Mrs. Hale, I mean Ruth." Ruth looked at her for a long time. "They told me what happened," she said finally. "You didn't leave." Melissa shook her head. "I couldn't. Most people do," Ruth replied. The two women sat in silence. The television on the wall played a commercial for life insurance, smiling families, promises of security. Melissa almost laughed at the irony. "I thought this volunteering thing would just be a chore," she said quietly. "But I felt something today, something I haven't felt in a long time." Ruth tilted her head. "And what was that?" "Fear," Melissa said. "But not for me, for her." Ruth's expression softened. "That's the beginning of empathy," she said, "when someone else's heartbeat becomes more important than your own." That night, Melissa stayed until after midnight. When the doctor finally came out and said, "She's stable," she burst into tears. Exhaustion, relief, guilt all tangled together. As she left the hospital, Ruth was still there, waiting in the lobby. "You didn't have to stay," Melissa said. "I know," Ruth replied. "But neither did you." The drive home was silent. The city lights blurred against the rain-streaked windshield. When she finally walked into the house, Ethan was waiting, Worry etched across his face. "You've been gone all day," he said. "I called twice." "I know," Melissa said softly, setting down her bag. One of the residents collapsed. "Is she?" "She's alive," Melissa said. Then, after a pause, "But I don't think I'll ever be the same." Ethan looked at her at the exhaustion, the trembling, the sincerity, and realized this was the first time in years she wasn't talking about herself. He took her hand. "You stayed," he said. "Yeah," she whispered. "I stayed." The next weekend, she showed up early, without being asked. Ruth watched her from across the courtyard, unseen, as Melissa helped Mrs. Whitaker with her hair, then read aloud to Mr. Delgado, who nodded along, smiling faintly. It wasn't perfect. She still flinched at some smells, still sighed when the hours dragged on, but there was something new in her rhythm, something real. Weeks passed. The residents began greeting her with warmth instead of polite distance. "Morning, Miss Melissa. There's my sunshine." The nurses started trusting her with harder tasks. And Ruth, though she rarely intervened, noticed. Then one afternoon, Ruth approached her quietly as Melissa folded linens. "You've changed," Ruth said. Melissa stopped. "I don't know if I've changed," she admitted, "but I think I'm starting to see people instead of problems." Ruth smiled faintly. "That's the difference between pity and love." They stood together in rare peace, sunlight falling through the wide window onto the floor between them. For the first time, there was no tension in Ruth's voice when she said, "I'm proud of you, Melissa." Melissa didn't reply. She couldn't. Her throat tightened, and all she could do was nod. The transformation Ruth had been waiting to see had begun not through money or guilt, but through something fragile, born from human touch and fear of loss. But this test wasn't over. It was only halfway through. Next, it would be Ethan's turn, and his lesson would cut even deeper. Sunday morning dawned quiet, but Ethan Hale's mind refused to rest. The company's future was still uncertain, yet all he could think about was his mother, not as the billionaire he'd just discovered, but as the woman he had failed. For weeks, he'd replayed that moment in the conference room, the shock of seeing her across the table, the quiet strength in her eyes when she said, "I've waited 30 years." Those words haunted him more than any debt or deadline. He hadn't been back to Maple Ridge since that first day. At first, he told himself it was because he was busy. Deep down, though, he was afraid of the silence that came after, "I'm sorry," afraid to face a version of himself that his mother had already seen too clearly. But now, something had shifted. Watching Melissa come home each Saturday with sore hands and swollen eyes, hearing her tell small stories about the residents, about kindness, about loss, about people who had nothing left but dignity, it had cracked something open inside him. That afternoon, Ethan drove to Maple Ridge alone. The air was heavy with the scent of wet pavement and the faint hum of distant traffic. When he entered the lobby, the receptionist smiled knowingly. "Mrs. Hale's son?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan said quietly. "Room 201. He walked down the corridor slowly, his footsteps soft against the linoleum floor. Through half-open doors he saw fragments of lives, an old man asleep with a Bible on his chest, 2 women laughing over jigsaw puzzles, a nurse humming to herself. Every door felt like a lesson in patience and fragility. When he reached his mother's room, he hesitated before knocking. "Come in," her familiar voice said. Ruth sat at a small table, sorting through papers. She didn't look surprised to see him. "Ethan," she said simply. "Hi, Mom." He stood awkwardly by the door until she gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit." For a moment, neither spoke. Ruth broke the silence first. "You haven't been here since the day you made your promise." "I know," he said. "I should have come sooner." "Yes," Ruth said, not unkindly. "You should have." Ethan leaned forward, his voice unsteady. "I've been thinking about what you said, about Dad, about why you hid everything." Ruth didn't interrupt. She just waited, as she always had. "I thought success was about control," he said. "Owning more, earning more, proving something. But you built an empire by serving people, not using them. You had every reason to flaunt it, and instead, you chose to live like you had nothing." Ruth smiled faintly. "I wasn't hiding who I was, Ethan. I was waiting to see who you'd become." Her words sank deep. Ethan looked down, his voice cracking. "And what did you see?" "A boy who worked hard but forgot why," Ruth said softly. A man who wanted to be respected so badly that he stopped respecting others. Ethan's throat tightened. I'm sorry, Mom, for everything, for what we said, for what we did. You didn't deserve that. Ruth studied him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took his hand. I know you're sorry, but guilt is easy, Ethan. Responsibility is harder. The question is, what will you do with what you know now? He swallowed. Whatever it takes. She released his hand and nodded toward the window. Do you see that man out there? Ethan turned. Outside, an elderly man was struggling to plant small flowers in a garden bed, his hands trembling from age. That's Mr. Delgado, Ruth said. He used to build machines that made other people rich. Now he just wants to feel useful. Go help him. Ethan blinked. Now? Yes, now, Ruth said. If you can't make time for someone who can't give you anything back, then you haven't learned a thing. So he did. He walked outside, knelt beside Mr. Delgado, and helped him dig shallow holes in the soil. At first they worked in silence. Then the old man said, You, her boy? Ethan smiled slightly. Yeah, that obvious? Your mother's a tough lady, Delgado said, but she's fair. Saved my friend's house once, paid his mortgage quiet, never said a word. We only found out after she left town. Ethan stopped digging. She did that? Son, Delgado said, patting his shoulder. You got no idea what she's done for people who didn't even know her name. When Ethan returned inside, his hands were dirty, his shirt streaked with soil, but something in him felt clean for the first time in years. Ruth looked up from her papers. Well, she's incredible, he said quietly. I never knew. You weren't supposed to, Ruth said. Not until you were ready to value what can't be bought. He sat down again, eyes full of unspoken things. I want to be better, Mom. I want Zoe to grow up knowing the right kind of wealth, kindness, decency, gratitude, the things you built, not the things I chased. Ruth's eyes softened. Then start now. Bring her here. Let her see what it means to show up. He nodded. We will. Every week if we have to. Ruth smiled, the kind of smile that had always said you're learning. Good, because next week you'll both help serve lunch. Ethan laughed quietly. A businessman serving soup. That'll be a first. Ruth chuckled. Every empire starts with service, Ethan. Even mine. That afternoon, he left Maple Ridge feeling lighter than he'd felt in decades. He didn't drive home right away. Instead, he stopped at a park and sat on a bench watching parents push their children on swings. For the first time, he didn't feel envy for anyone around him. He felt gratitude. When he finally pulled into the driveway that evening, Melissa met him at the door. How did it go? Ethan smiled. She made me dig holes and plant flowers. Melissa laughed softly. That sounds like her. Ethan nodded. It was perfect. And in that quiet exchange, two people humbled. Rebuilding piece by piece, the Hales began the long climb from pride to peace. But Ruth Hale wasn't finished yet. There was still one last test waiting for them, the reckoning that would decide not just their inheritance but the kind of legacy they'd leave behind. 1 full year later, on a bright Saturday in May, the Maple Ridge courtyard looked like something out of a small-town fair. Fresh flowers lined the pathways, residents gathered under umbrellas, and the air carried that rare mix of sunlight and nostalgia. For most of the people there, it was just another weekend. But for the Hale family, it was Judgment Day. Ethan, Melissa, and Zoe arrived together not in suits, not in panic, but in plain clothes that smelled faintly of home. Over the past 12 months, they had done what Ruth asked. Melissa had not missed a single Saturday, not one. Ethan had spent nearly every Sunday volunteering, fixing old wheelchairs, painting rooms, and learning to listen. Even Zoe had become a small celebrity among the residents, bringing cookies and laughter wherever she went. Yet as they stood at the gates that morning, there was an unspoken tension. Ruth had called them the night before, saying only, "Tomorrow, come as a family. I have something to ask." Inside, the staff greeted them warmly. "Back again, Mrs. Hale?" one nurse said to Melissa with a grin. "Of course," Melissa replied. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." And she meant it. They found Ruth waiting in the garden, seated beneath a cherry tree in full bloom. Her posture was regal, but her expression softer than Ethan remembered. Time hadn't dimmed her authority, it had deepened it. "You're here," she said simply. "All of you." Ethan nodded. "We're here, Mom." Ruth gestured to the chairs around her. "Sit, we have things to discuss." When they were seated, Ruth's gaze moved slowly from one face to the next. 1 year, she said. 52 Saturdays. 52 chances to prove that love can outlast shame. Melissa's eyes glistened. "I didn't think I could do it," she admitted. "The first week I hated every minute, but somewhere along the way I stopped counting hours. I started caring." Ruth smiled faintly. "That's how love sneaks in. It never announces itself. It just becomes the habit you can't live without." Zoe leaned forward. "Grandma, you sound like a teacher." Ruth chuckled. "Maybe I am." Then her tone shifted, steady, deliberate. "But now I need to ask you something important." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick brown envelope, the kind that looked heavy even when it wasn't. Inside this are documents the full ownership transfer of Oakhaven Group. Every share, every account, every asset. "It's yours, Ethan, if you want it." The air changed instantly. Ethan froze. Melissa's breath caught. Even Zoe sat perfectly still. "Mine?" Ethan whispered. "All of it?" Ruth nodded. "But before you say yes, I want to ask you one question." She leaned forward, her eyes sharp, cutting straight through his composure. "If I told you that I was giving it all away instead, every dollar, every property, every asset to hospitals, schools, and shelters, would you still love me the same?" The silence that followed stretched long enough for the breeze to speak. Ethan's first instinct was to answer fast, to say what sounded right, but Ruth's gaze warned him not to lie. Finally, he exhaled. "Yes," he said quietly, "because I already lost you once. I won't make that mistake again." Ruth turned to Melissa. "And you?" Melissa's eyes filled with tears. "You already gave me more than money ever could. You gave me back my humanity." Then Ruth looked at Zoe. "And what about you, sweetheart?" Zoe grinned, her answer immediate. "If you gave it away, other people could be happy too. That'd make you a superhero." Ruth laughed, a sound Ethan hadn't heard in decades. "Out of the mouths of children," she said softly, "the only ones who still see clearly." She set the envelope on the table. "Then it's settled. You've passed the test." Ethan blinked. "What test?" "The one your father made me promise to give you," she said. "The one that would show me whether wealth would make you greedy or grateful. I'm not giving it all away, Ethan. I'm entrusting it to you, but only under 3 conditions." She held up a finger for each. "First, you will never sit as CEO. You'll hire people wiser than you to lead. Second, half of all profits will continue to go towards social programs. Third, you will never let money decide how you treat another human being, including me." Ethan nodded slowly, his voice thick. "I agree. To all of it." Melissa reached for his hand. "So do I." Ruth's eyes softened. "Then for the first time, I see the man your father hoped you'd become." She looked at Zoe. "And you, young lady, you remind me of the person I once was. Never lose that." Zoe smiled. "Does this mean we're all good again?" Ruth chuckled. "Better than good. We're family." For a moment, no one moved. Then Ethan stood and walked around the table, pulling his mother gently to her feet. He wrapped his arms around her, not like a guilty son begging for forgiveness, but like a man finally understanding love without condition. Melissa joined them, and then Zoe, small arms circling their waists. The 4 of them stood together beneath the cherry blossoms, a picture of what redemption looks like when pride finally lets go. As they broke apart, Ruth handed Ethan the envelope. "Now go live the lesson," she said. "And remember, what you give will always outlast what you keep." That evening, Ruth watched from her window as her family's car disappeared down the long drive. For the first time in 30 years, her heart felt still, not from loss, but from peace. But the story wasn't over. In the days ahead, Ethan and Melissa would face the true challenge of wealth, not earning it, but keeping their integrity once they had it. And Ruth, quietly, would keep one last surprise, the final gift she hadn't yet revealed. 7 years later, the Hale family lived a life that looked simple from the outside, but every detail was shaped by what they had learned. The house wasn't new, but it was warm. The company wasn't run from a tower, but from an office where everyone knew each other's names. And at its heart, still quietly watching over it all, was Ruth Hale. Oakhaven Group had flourished under new leadership. True to her word, Ruth never returned as CEO, and Ethan never took the title. Instead, he worked as an advisor, a man who finally understood that power wasn't in control, but in trust. Half of the company's profits went to schools, veterans programs, and senior care facilities across the country. Employees called it the Hale Promise. Reporters tried to romanticize it, but those who knew the truth understood it wasn't a business strategy. It was an apology turned into action. At home, Melissa had changed too. She no longer spent weekends shopping or managing fundraisers to impress neighbors. Every Saturday, she still drove to Maple Ridge, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to. The residents called her Sunshine. Even the new nurses deferred to her when someone needed comfort. "It started as a punishment," she once told a young volunteer, "but it became the part of my week that keeps me human." Ruth had moved back in with the family a few years earlier. This time, no one argued about space or money or pride. Ethan had remodeled the downstairs den into a quiet, sunlit room for her. There was a single armchair by the window, stacks of books beside it, and a photo wall that grew larger every season. One afternoon, as she sat there with a cup of tea, Zoe, now a college freshman, burst in holding a large envelope. "Grandma, I got in?" Ruth smiled. "Where, sweetheart?" "Boston University," Zoe said proudly. "Social work major. I want to help families like we used to be." Ruth laughed softly. "Then you'll be richer than all of us." Moments later, her younger brother, Liam, came bounding down the stairs in his high school uniform. "Grandma, guess what? I want to be a doctor. Like the ones who help the residents at Maple Ridge. But I'll treat people who can't pay." Ruth looked at him, her eyes glistening. "Your grandfather would be so proud. He always said real success is when your work heals more than it earns." That evening, the entire family gathered around the dinner table, not a formal holiday feast, just a meal of roast chicken, laughter, and stories that never seemed to end. Ethan raised a glass of water, no champagne, no ceremony, and said, "To Mom, for teaching us what it means to start over." Ruth smiled, shaking her head. "No, son, to starting right, not just over." After dinner, Zoe pulled out her phone. "Grandma, let's make a video," she said. "For my social work project. It's about what happiness means to different generations." Ruth agreed. The camera rolled. "Grandma," Zoe began, "what's happiness to you?" Ruth thought for a moment, then looked straight into the lens. "Happiness is waking up every morning knowing you've made peace with your past and still having someone to make breakfast for." The clip went viral weeks later. Thousands of comments poured in from strangers who saw their own families in that simple truth. But Ruth never read the comments. She didn't need to. She could see her legacy sitting right across the table every night. One crisp spring afternoon, Ruth returned to Maple Ridge not as a resident but as a donor. The facility had expanded, with a new wing dedicated to rehabilitation and memory care. A plaque by the entrance read, "The Hale Family Foundation, built on the belief that love is the only inheritance that lasts." As she walked the halls, many of the older residents still remembered her. "Ruth," cried Mrs. Whitaker, now nearly 90. "You came back." "Of course I did," Ruth said, embracing her. "This place gave me my second life." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ruth sat in the courtyard with Ethan. The air smelled faintly of lilacs. "You kept your promise," she said. "So did you," Ethan replied. "Do you ever miss the old life?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "No, the man who lived that life was chasing ghosts. This one's just grateful to be home." Ruth leaned back, eyes closed, a calm warmth spreading across her face. "Good," she whispered. "Then I can rest easy knowing our story found its ending." Ethan looked at her, emotion catching in his throat. "No, Mom, not its ending. Its beginning." The screen would fade there. If this were a film, the family together in the golden light, laughter mixing with the soft hum of life outside. But the narrator would speak one last time. In a country where success is measured in numbers, the Hale family learned that the real currency of life isn't what you earn, it's what you give. And when love stops being conditional, it stops running out. Ruth Hale passed peacefully 3 years later, surrounded by her family. Her final note, left on her nightstand, was only a single sentence. The fortune was never the money, it was all of you. And that, as every good story teaches, was the kind of wealth no one could ever lose.